mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I hate you. I hate you. This is out of control. Don't fuck with me, Jeffrey. I kill.
Do you know the chilling story of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, one of the most notorious serial killers in history? Known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, Dahmer's horrific crimes shocked the world and left an indelible mark on the true crime landscape. Have you ever wondered what drove a seemingly ordinary man to commit unspeakable acts of violence and depravity? And what does his case reveal about the darker side of human nature? Join us as we delve into the terrifying story of Jeffrey Dahmer, exploring his twisted journey from an unassuming young man to one of the most infamous killers in history. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, infamously known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first of two sons to Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a Marquette University chemistry student and later a research chemist, and Joyce Annette Dahmer, a teletype machine instructor. His early life was marked by a mix of attention and neglect. While some accounts suggest he was deprived of affection as an infant, others indicate he was doted upon as a young child. His mother, however, was a hypochondriac who frequently battled depression and demanded constant attention, leaving little room for young Jeffrey to feel secure. His father's academic pursuits often kept him away from home, adding to the familial instability that would shape Jeffrey's early years. As a child, Dahmer was described as energetic and happy. However, this demeanor changed drastically after he underwent double hernia surgery at the age of 4. Following this procedure, he became noticeably subdued. His elementary school years were marked by his quiet and timid nature, exacerbated by his parents' strained relationship. Joyce's depressive episodes and frequent arguments with Lionel created a volatile home environment. Jeffrey's sense of abandonment deepened as his mother's health deteriorated and she became increasingly withdrawn. By the time his younger brother David was born in 1966, the family had moved to Doylestown, Ohio, and Lionel had begun his career as an analytical chemist. From a young age, Dahmer exhibited a morbid fascination with dead animals. This interest likely began when, as a child, he watched his father remove animal bones from beneath their home. By the time the family moved to Bath Township, Ohio, in 1968, his father, mistaking this for scientific curiosity, taught Jeffrey how to safely bleach and preserve bones. This knowledge would later play a chilling role in Dahmer's crimes. As a teenager, Dahmer became increasingly isolated. He started drinking heavily by the age of 14, often concealing alcohol in his jacket and drinking during school hours. Despite being intelligent, his grades declined, and he became known as a class clown, staging pranks that mocked disabilities and mimicked his seizures. His behavior earned him notoriety among his peers, but did little to mask his deepening sense of alienation. By his mid-teens, Dahmer realized he was gay, but kept his sexuality hidden. His fantasies of control and dominance began to intertwine with thoughts of dissection and submission, leading him to plan his first attack on a male jogger. Although he never acted on this particular plan, it marked the beginning of his descent into violence. In 1978, shortly after graduating high school, Dahmer committed his first murder. On June 18, he lured 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks to his family home under the pretense of drinking beer together. When Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer bludgeoned him with a dumbbell, strangled him, and later masturbated over the body. The next day, he dismembered Hicks's body, dissolved the flesh in acid, and scattered the crushed bones in the woods behind his house. This gruesome act marked the beginning of a killing spree that would span over a decade. Following this murder, Dahmer attempted to rebuild a semblance of normalcy. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out due to his worsening alcohol addiction. In 1979, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, where he trained as a medical specialist. Initially, his performance was average, but his drinking soon rendered him unfit for service. He was discharged in 1981 and moved to Miami Beach, Florida, where he worked at a delicatessen. Unable to manage his finances or control his drinking, he returned to Ohio to live with his father. Dahmer's instability persisted, and his father eventually sent him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, in late 1981. This move was intended to provide structure and stability, and for a time, Dahmer appeared to comply. He attended church, performed household chores, and found work as a phlebotomist. However, his dark impulses resurfaced. In 1982, he was arrested for indecent exposure at a state fair. By 1985, he had secured a job at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, but his fantasies of dominance grew stronger. Dahmer began frequenting gay bathhouses and bookstores, often drugging his partners to render them unconscious. He used these opportunities to explore his fantasies of control and submission, which escalated to the point where he attempted to dig up the grave of a recently deceased young man, though he abandoned the effort when the soil proved too hard. In 1986, he was arrested for masturbating in front of two young boys near a river. He initially claimed he had been urinating, but later admitted to the offense and was sentenced to probation and counseling. On November 20th, 1987, Dahmer, at the time still residing with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, had already begun to develop a pattern of luring young men into his home under false pretenses. His history of deviant behavior had escalated from his teenage years, where his fascination with death, dissection, and alcohol began to take root. At 27 years old, he appeared unremarkable to those around him, a quiet, unassuming man, holding down a job at a chocolate factory and living a life that, on the surface, seemed normal. However, beneath that facade, Dahmer was already deep into his dark obsession. On that fateful evening, he encountered 25-year-old Stephen Hicks, who had been hitchhiking along a road near Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer, always on the lookout for vulnerable men to satisfy his sinister desires, offered Stephen a ride. After a brief conversation in the car, Dahmer invited Stephen back to his apartment for drinks. What happened next was the beginning of a horrific series of murders that would later shock the world. Once inside his apartment, Dahmer offered Stephen a drink, which he spiked with sleeping pills. As Stephen began to feel the effects, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, knocking him unconscious before strangling him to death. Afterward, Dahmer dismembered Stephen's body, keeping parts of it as trophies. He later confessed to having kept some of the remains in his apartment, preserving them in a variety of disturbing ways. He would later go on to dismember and murder 16 more men, many of whom were either lured to his home or met him in places like bars and clubs. Dahmer's methodical killings, which included drugging his victims, murdering them, and then performing grotesque acts on their bodies, were carried out without detection for months. Dahmer's victims were typically young men of color, many of whom were marginalized members of society, easy targets for a man who understood how to exploit their vulnerabilities. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while living a double life as a serial killer allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. In a twisted way, Dahmer's apartment became a macabre museum, where he kept photographs of his victims in various states of mutilation. He also indulged in necrophilia with the corpses, his need for control and dominance pushing him into the realm of cannibalism. Dahmer later confessed that he had even considered eating parts of some of his victims, a horrific reflection of his deteriorating mental state. By the time he was finally apprehended in 1991, Dahmer had committed 17 murders over the course of several years. His arrest came after one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's clutches. Edwards ran into the street where he flagged down 2 police officers, leading them back to Dahmer's apartment. Upon investigating, officers found photographs of the dismembered bodies of his previous victims, along with human remains scattered throughout the apartment. Dahmer was arrested and later convicted of all 17 murders. His trial was a media frenzy, as the public was both horrified and fascinated by the details of his crimes. During his sentencing, Dahmer gave a chilling interview where he expressed no remorse, acknowledging his acts as horrific, but also admitting that he had a compulsive desire to continue killing. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was murdered in prison by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver. Scarver, who had been assigned to clean the prison gymnasium alongside Dahmer and another inmate, reportedly attacked Dahmer with a metal bar. Dahmer was pronounced dead shortly thereafter, leaving behind a legacy of terror that would continue to haunt the memories of those affected by his gruesome acts. Dahmer's trial began on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee, where he faced 15 counts of first-degree murder. By pleading guilty to the charges on January 13th, Dahmer waived his rights to a trial to establish guilt as required by Wisconsin law. This decision came after a series of legal deliberations. Attorneys for the defense and prosecution debated whether Dahmer suffered from a mental or personality disorder, with the prosecution arguing that his disorders did not impair his ability to understand or resist his criminal actions. On the other hand, the defense suggested that Dahmer's compulsive behavior and obsessions were indicative of mental illness, rendering him incapable of controlling his impulses. The defense presented expert testimonies, including that of Dr. Fred Berlin, who argued that Dahmer's necrophilic tendencies, particularly his drive to have sexual encounters with corpses, indicated he was suffering from a mental disease. Dr. Judith Becker, a professor of psychiatry, also diagnosed Dahmer with necrophilia, noting that Dahmer himself had mentioned he preferred comatose individuals over dead ones. Dr. Carl Wallstrom, a forensic psychiatrist, expanded on this diagnosis, citing borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, and a psychotic disorder. These testimonies painted a picture of Dahmer as an individual driven by uncontrollable impulses, bound by a pathological obsession with his desires. In response, the prosecution countered with expert testimony of its own. Dr. Fred Fosdahl, a forensic psychiatrist, argued that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions at the time of the murders. He characterized Dahmer as calculating and cunning, suggesting that the murders were not impulsive acts driven by a mental disorder, but rather carefully planned executions, motivated by lust and the desire for control over his victims. Dr. Park Dietz, another expert for the prosecution, further emphasized that Dahmer's actions were premeditated. He highlighted that Dahmer went to great lengths to ensure that his victims were isolated and that his actions were neither compulsive nor impulsive. Instead, Dahmer's routine of drinking alcohol before committing the murders, according to Dietz, suggested that he was suppressing inhibitions rather than acting out of uncontrollable desire. Dietz's testimony also revealed that Dahmer identified with powerful villains in films like The Exorcist III and Return of the Jedi, a notion that the defense sought to discredit as mere fantasy. Dietz explained that Dahmer's identification with these characters reflected his desire for power over his victims and his need to control them in life and death. In his diagnosis, Dietz cited substance use disorder, paraphilia, and schizotypal personality disorder, but dismissed the idea that Dahmer's actions were the result of a mental illness that left him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Additionally, two other experts, Dr. George Palermo, a forensic psychiatrist, and Dr. Samuel Friedman, a clinical psychologist, provided their assessments. Palermo suggested that Dahmer's motivations were rooted in a deep-seated self-loathing and a desire to eliminate the object of his attraction by killing his victims. Palermo diagnosed Dahmer with a mixed personality disorder, incorporating traits of antisocial behavior, sadism, fetishism, and necrophilia, but maintained that Dahmer was legally sane. Dr. Friedman, on the other hand, attributed Dahmer's behavior to his overwhelming need for companionship, which he sought to satisfy through control and violence. He too determined that Dahmer was not psychotic but had a personality disorder with sadistic and obsessive-compulsive traits. After 2 weeks of testimony, the trial concluded with closing arguments on February 14, 1992. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle argued that Dahmer's murders were the result of a mental illness, a sickness that Dahmer had discovered rather than chosen. Boyle painted a portrait of a lonely, deeply troubled individual whose compulsive behavior led him to commit unspeakable acts. He emphasized that Dahmer was incapable of controlling his impulses and that his actions were driven by a mental disorder. In contrast, prosecutor Michael McCann presented Dahmer as a man fully aware of his actions and in complete control of them. McCann argued that Dahmer's desire to evade detection and his methodical planning of the murders indicated a man who was calculating and aware of his criminality. McCann contended that Dahmer's plea of guilty but insane
didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world
was a deliberate attempt to escape full responsibility for his crimes. He painted Dahmer not as a victim of mental illness, but as a sadistic predator who manipulated his circumstances to prolong his gratification. The jury deliberated and returned their verdict on February 15, 1992. Dahmer was found to be legally sane at the time of the murders. This decision signified that Dahmer was capable of understanding the criminality of his actions and resisting the urges that led to the killings. While 2 jurors dissented on the verdict, Dahmer was convicted on all 15 counts of first-degree murder. On February 17, 1992, Dahmer was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Lawrence Graham imposed a sentence of life imprisonment plus 10 years for the first 2 counts, and for the remaining 13, Dahmer was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 70 years. Since Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853, the court had no option to impose a capital sentence. Dahmer was allowed to address the court before his sentence was finalized. In a brief statement, Dahmer expressed remorse, emphasizing that he did not want to be free and that he wished for his own death. He acknowledged the immense harm he had caused and stated that he found some peace in the knowledge that his crimes had been the result of mental illness, even if society could never forgive him. Following his sentencing, Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was placed in solitary confinement for the first year due to concerns for his safety. During his time in prison, Dahmer received a great deal of correspondence from individuals, many of whom sent money that Dahmer spent on personal items. After a year in solitary confinement, he was moved to a less secure unit, where he worked cleaning toilets and later expanded his duties to cleaning the gymnasium.
Took place inside the maximum security prison in Wisconsin, where he was serving 999 years.
In prison, Dahmer experienced a significant spiritual transformation, largely spurred by his own reading and discussions with a prison chaplain. In May 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister with the Church of Christ. Dahmer's commitment to Christianity became evident, and he frequently discussed the nature of death, his crimes, and his religious beliefs with Ratcliffe. Dahmer admitted that he had come to believe that his actions were a result of his lack of faith and moral compass, which he now sought to amend. However, Dahmer's time in prison was cut short. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was killed by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver while cleaning a staff locker room with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Dahmer himself. Scarver, who later claimed that he had been instructed by God to kill Dahmer, bludgeoned him with a metal bar, causing severe head injuries. Dahmer was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead an hour later. Anderson, who had been attacked alongside Dahmer, died 2 days later from his injuries. Dahmer's death brought mixed reactions. While some members of the victims' families expressed relief, others mourned the fact that Dahmer was no longer suffering as his victims had. Dahmer's mother, Joyce, expressed anger toward the media for their portrayal of her son's death. Scarver was later sentenced to 2 additional life terms for the murders of Dahmer and Anderson. Dahmer's body was cremated in September 1995, with his ashes divided between his parents. His brain, initially preserved for medical research, was later cremated in December of that year after a dispute between his parents. In the aftermath of Dahmer's crimes, the city of Milwaukee struggled with the profound trauma left behind. A candlelight vigil was held to honor the victims and promote healing, while the demolishing of Dahmer's Oxford apartments in 1992 marked an attempt to erase the physical remnants of his horrifying actions. Dahmer's estate was eventually auctioned off, and many of his possessions were destroyed after a group raised funds to do so. This was part of an effort to prevent Dahmer's infamy from being glorified. In the years following his death, Dahmer's family, his father Lionel and stepmother Sherry, continued to live their lives in the public eye, with Lionel publishing a book in 1994 to offer his perspective. Dahmer's mother, Joyce, passed away from cancer in 2000. Dahmer's brother, David, chose to change his surname and live in relative obscurity, distancing himself from the notorious legacy of his family. Jeffrey Dahmer was responsible for the brutal murders of 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. His crimes spanned multiple locations, with 12 victims killed in his apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, 3 at his grandmother's house in West Allis, and 2 others in different locations. Dahmer's victims came from diverse ethnic backgrounds, including 9 who were black. Although Dahmer claimed that the race of his victims did not matter to him, he was notably attracted to a particular body type. Forensic studies later confirmed that his victims shared specific physical traits, suggesting a psychological attraction to certain anthropometric features. Most of Dahmer's murders followed a similar pattern. His victims were typically drugged with sedatives and then strangled. His first 2 victims were killed in ways that deviated from his later methods. Stephen Mark Hicks, 18, was Dahmer's first victim. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer lured Hicks, a hitchhiker, on his way to a rock concert, to his home in Bath, Ohio. Dahmer bludgeoned him with a dumbbell and strangled him before dismembering the body. He pulverized Hicks's bones with a hammer and scattered the remains in the woods behind his family's house. The second victim, Stephen Walter Tuomi, 25, was killed in a rented room at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee on November 20, 1987. Dahmer later claimed to have no memory of the murder, but it was clear that he had bludgeoned Tuomi to death in a drunken stupor. His body was dismembered at Dahmer's grandmother's house, but the remains were never found. A few months later, Dahmer killed 14-year-old James Edward Doxtator, luring him to West Allis with the promise of $50 for nude photos. After strangling Doxtator, Dahmer kept the body for a week in the basement before dismembering it and discarding the remains in the trash. On March 24, 1988, Dahmer killed 22-year-old Richard Guerrero in his West Allis home. Guerrero was drugged and strangled, his body dismembered in the basement. Dahmer then dissolved the flesh in acid and disposed of the bones, keeping the skull for months before finally discarding it. 1 year later, Dahmer would kill 24-year-old Anthony Lee Sears on March 25, 1989, at his grandmother's house. Sears was drugged, strangled, and dismembered, and Dahmer preserved his skull and genitals, which were later found in a filing cabinet after his arrest. In 1990, Dahmer moved into a new apartment at 924 North 25th Street. His first victim at the new location was 32-year-old Raymond Lamont Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, whom Dahmer lured from a tavern. After drugging Smith's drink, Dahmer strangled him on the kitchen floor and retained his skull, spray painting it. The following month, Dahmer killed 27-year-old Edward Warren Smith. Smith, a known acquaintance, was last seen with Dahmer at a party before being drugged, strangled, and dismembered. His skeleton was acidified, but his skull was destroyed when it was accidentally placed in the oven. On September 2, 1990, Dahmer killed 22-year-old Ernest Marquez Miller, a dance student he met outside a bookstore. Dahmer was particularly drawn to Miller's physique. He severed Miller's carotid artery, causing fatal blood loss, and dismembered the body in the bathtub. Dahmer stored the entire skeleton in a filing cabinet, and his heart, liver, biceps, and portions of his thighs were kept in the freezer for later consumption. The next victim, 22-year-old David Courtney Thomas, was lured to Dahmer's apartment with the promise of money for nude photos. After drugging Thomas, Dahmer decided he was not his type and strangled him. Dahmer photographed the dismemberment process, but no remains were ever found. In 1991, Dahmer continued his killing spree, beginning with 17-year-old Curtis Durrell Straughter, whom he encountered waiting at a bus stop. Straughter was drugged, strangled, and dismembered in Dahmer's apartment, where his skull, hands, and genitals were retained. Then on April 7, 1991, Dahmer killed 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, whom he subjected to his drilling technique. Dahmer drilled holes into Lindsay's skull and injected hydrochloric acid into his brain, hoping to create a submissive, unresistant state. When Lindsay regained consciousness, Dahmer drugged him again, but this time, he killed him by strangulation. Dahmer flayed Lindsay's body and kept the skin for weeks before discarding it. On May 24, 1991, Dahmer killed Tony Anthony Hughes, a 31-year-old deaf man. Hughes communicated with Dahmer using handwritten notes, and he was promised money for nude photos. Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid into Hughes's skull, killing him. He kept Hughes's body on his bedroom floor for 3 days before dismembering it. His skull was identified later through dental records. Just 3 days later, Dahmer killed Konorak Synthesomphone, a 14-year-old boy whose older brother had been a victim of Dahmer's in 1988. Dahmer drugged Synthesomphone, injected acid into his brain, and left him disoriented in the street. When police arrived, Dahmer convinced them that he and Cynthia Somphone were lovers. The officers left, and Dahmer resumed his attack, injecting more acid into the boy's brain, causing his death. On June 30th, 1991, Dahmer attended the Chicago Pride Parade before encountering 20-year-old Matt Cleveland Turner at a bus stop. Turner was persuaded to accompany Dahmer to Milwaukee for a photo shoot. Dahmer drugged and strangled him, then dismembered his body. Dahmer stored Turner's head and internal organs in the freezer and placed his torso in a 57-gallon drum. 5 days later, Dahmer killed 23-year-old Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberger, whom he had met at a gay bar. Weinberger was subjected to the drilling technique, with boiling water injected into his skull. He later recalled that Weinberger was the only victim to die with his eyes open. On July 5, 1991, Dahmer killed 24-year-old Oliver Joseph Lacey, a bodybuilding enthusiast. Lacey was drugged and strangled with a leather strap before being decapitated. Dahmer kept his head and heart in the refrigerator and his skeleton as part of his growing shrine. The final victim was 25-year-old Joseph Arthur Bradehoft, a father of 3 who had come to Milwaukee in search of work. Dahmer lured him to his apartment and killed him on July 19th. He left the body on his bed for 2 days before decapitating it. Dahmer placed Bradehoft's head in the refrigerator and his torso in the 57-gallon drum. These gruesome murders, spanning over 13 years, were characterized by horrific acts of violence, manipulation, and a chillingly methodical approach. Dahmer's arrest in 1991 marked the end of his reign of terror, but the gruesome details of his crimes continue to haunt the public's imagination. That's all for this video. We hope you have found this video informative and interesting. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon for more interesting videos like this. Thank you for watching our video.